All right, everyone. Next video, we just finished talking about essential questions and we're moving on to the materials box. I'm going to switch over to this version. And the idea here is that you list the materials that you have used for planning your lesson and the materials that you'll use during the lesson. You don't have to be overly thorough here. So you don't have to list the material and then write a long explanation of what the material is and exactly how you're using it. You're going to have a chance to do that on the lesson analysis. So you do want to keep this on the brief side, but at the same time, if it's not pretty clear what the material is being used for, then you should explain it. For example, in our driver's ed lesson, we're going to use some sort of visual presentation. Let's make it a Google slide presentation of road signs, and it's going to have some questions for students to answer embedded in it and some explanations. So if all I wrote was Google Slides presentation, that's it. Then, as the person planning the lesson, you may think, well, that makes sense to me because I know exactly what's in that presentation. But I'm the assessor, and I'm also going to be reading your lesson plan. You're basically writing this for your assessor to be able to score you well in all those test domains, in all the components of test domain 1. You can see how it's even labeled. This score informs test 1D, or this information informs the score for test 1D. So you need to clarify. Google Slides presentation, including pictures of the 10 road signs students are learning, questions, and explanations, period. That's it. So name it and then explain how it's being used. Sometimes students will say, do I have to name everything? Like if I'm using colored pencils and I'm using markers and I'm using pieces of blue paper and why not? Put it all in there and give a brief explanation of it. Now, if students are using pens and pencils to write and paper, I don't know that you need to go to that length. Pens. Students need pens for writing. We're talking about the big materials that are important for teaching this lesson. So if we were filling this out for our driver's ed lesson, and just off the top of my head, we would need to include our our Google Slides presentation. That's definitely material. And can I just write it on there and then make it and then have it ready the day of my lesson? No. I need to write it in. I need to create it. And when I send this lesson plan to my assessor, I also send the Google Slides presentation link so that that person can look at it. In fact, you could embed the link in here and I could go right to it so I could look to see what you're showing. Other materials, I know that we're going to play an icebreaker game at the beginning of the lesson, a small group, and whatever. We haven't planned that in detail, but whatever materials are needed for that. Let's say that we're going to tape road signs to the back of to the kids' backs, and they've got to try to explain to someone what the road sign is on their back without using the word. So that the material would be small pictures of road signs for icebreaker game, to be taped on students' backs. That might be the explanation. We're also going to do a role play activity. So whatever materials are needed for that, whether it's masking tape for taping off lanes on the floor of the classroom, placards for students to wear around their necks, naming the kind of car they are, scenario cards for students to hold to explain to them what they're doing in the role play. We'd include all of that. The assessments that we're giving, the Google form, we'd need to put Google form assessment of 10 road signs, the post assessment over all 10 road signs and explanations, paper-based. So it's just a list of all the materials that are required for the lesson. And then going back to our presentation, what are you going to use for planning? What are you using for teaching? What technology have you used for planning? And what technology for teaching? The technology for planning means, if I was going to teach this lesson for driver's ed, I might create it all out of my head, but I also very likely to get on the internet and look around because other people have taught this in front of me, and why not use something that someone else has created that's excellent? But if I borrow something, I need to reference it. As someone that goes and watches lots of people teach, sometimes people will turn stuff into me, and it's so incredibly good. It's weird for me to have to say, did you make this? Because it's really good. Because the implication is, you couldn't do this on your own. So I prefer it when someone says, here's this handout and here's where I got it. And that way I already know, okay, you didn't make this. You found it online, which is fine. And you've given credit where credit is due. So be sure that you put everything in the materials box that should be there. Next, we have the differentiation box. So I know that you don't know a lot about your students for this pretend lesson. In fact, you have no students for your MAT lessons. We're just learning to fill out the lesson plans. But in an actual internship, of course, you'll know your students' names, and you'll know their ethnicities, and you'll know their genders, and you'll know a whole lot about them. And you will have collected this information, and then you'll think about what you know about your students, and you'll differentiate your lesson to meet some of their specific needs. For our practice lesson, one thing you can rely on is VAR and K. Remember the VARK assessment that you took? Visual, auditory, read, write, and kinesthetic. You should plan for all of those. In our driver's ed lesson, we have visual elements, we have auditory elements, kinesthetic elements, and read, write elements. So what we would do is in this box, I'd put, something like, I've differentiated for my visual learners in this way. And then I would tell a couple of things that I'm specifically doing for my visual learners. Underneath that, I differentiated for my auditory learners in this way. And then I would tell a couple of things I've included that I'm going to, make sure that we do orally because of the auditory learners. I do the same thing for my kinesthetic learners and the same thing for my read-write learners. So I'm telling you, for your group and your individual lessons for this course, I'll expect to see your differentiation for VAR and K. And that can be the limit of it because you don't know who the students are and you don't know much about them. So you don't know any of their particular special needs. Like if someone has ADHD and they need to have their directions repeated to them. You don't know if someone has an auditory special need and they need to sit on the right-hand side of the classroom, or they need to hear things loudly or repeated multiple times. We don't know that. And so we're just going to go with VAR and K. Now, these three boxes can be confusing. So I think if you'll just listen closely as I explain the difference between the three of them, you'll be good to go. The content representation box is about what you do as the teacher. If I'm teaching 10 road signs, they're identifying them and explaining the meanings, then that's the content of my lesson. And this box is asking me as the teacher to explain, how am I representing that content for students? Let's go to extremes. First we're going to start with something hopefully no one would ever choose to do. What if I tried to teach 10 road signs and their meanings to 9th grade students, and my plan was to only represent this content orally? I was going to lecture. I knew they all had a driver's manual, and I'd be like, yeah, get out your driver's manual and look at this page. And maybe half of them don't even take out the manual. And I don't ever hold up the manual. I don't show anything. I purely talk about each sign. Yield sign, triangular. It's got a red line around it. It says yield in the middle of it. And here's what it means. I would only be representing that content in one way. I would not make that choice, right? None of us would. We would go to the other end and we'd be like, gosh, I'm going to represent this content in several different ways. I'm going to show them the content visually through my presentation that has pictures, large, colorful pictures of the road signs, because that's what they look like when you're driving. And I'm going to explain the meanings of these road signs to them aloud. And I'm going to ask them to predict the meanings of the road signs. So then you're going to give a description of how you are representing the content for students. And I would say you need at least 2 really good ways that you're going to represent the content. As the teacher, what are you doing to show, to demonstrate the content? Expression is student-based. Well, if I'm up here representing the content in these ways, what am I asking students do to express their understanding of the content? Well, I ask them to answer questions that are based on the road signs. Am I going to ask them to participate in a role play in which they would have to use their understanding and express their understanding of the road signs? Again, this is it's going to feel like you're actually not planning out the details of the lesson plan specifically, or like writing down the steps. That comes on the next page. But you're going to pick out a couple, maybe the 2 best ways that you feel like you're asking students to express their understanding of the content, and you're going to explain those. So a couple of ways that you feel are strong ways that you're representing content for students, a couple of ways that you feel are strong ways that you're asking students to express their understanding of the content, and then a couple of ways that you feel like that you are really engaging students with the content. Now let's talk about the word engagement. I mean, in the best of all possible worlds, at the moment that I feel engaged with content, I am happy and having a great time. Like if I show a couple of really funny YouTube videos that involve traffic incidents where no one's injured, and it's just really maybe bad choices by drivers, and they represent the road signs, right? We're studying yield, and I've got 2 really good yielding videos that I know students are going to think are really interesting. That could be engagement. Now, if the 2 videos are really hilarious, but they don't really teach yield very well at all, then that's not a great example. I mean, it's funny, yes, and people might be laughing and having a good time, but the videos don't really teach them anything about yielding, and they don't serve as a good discussion springboard for us to talk about the concept of a yield. Then, that's not a good example. At the same time, what if I just showed you a picture of a yield sign and just said, we haven't talked about this road sign. I know you've seen it. What do you think it means? I want you to predict what you think this sign means for a driver. And I want you to, this is the key, I want you to write down what you think this means on a piece of paper that maybe I've given you. It's got, 1 through 10 with a line for each prediction. And you sit there and you write out your prediction. Now, I'm not showing you a funny video, and maybe you're not laughing your head off, but you're still engaged with content. And that counts as engagement. So don't think of engagement strictly as I've got to be, basically juggling and turning flips for them. Engagement does, it's important to get people's attention, but engagement means, are they doing something with the content? Now, hopefully when you plan the do something with content, you'll try to make it as interesting as possible. So what you're going to write in this box is a couple of ways that you feel like you're really engaging students, and this is important, and the engagement is easy to see. Like when I said, I'm not just saying, hey, everybody, what do you think yield means? Think about it, everybody. Just think about it. And then someone raise your hand. There's no way for me to measure the engagement of each individual student if I do it that way. I'm just asking everybody to think, and I can't see what you're thinking. And I'm only calling on 2 people to give an answer, maybe, or maybe even 1 person. And it could be I'm letting people shout out answers. That's not the right way to do it. If I really want to measure your engagement, the right way is I show you a sign and say, hey, everybody, on that piece of paper I've given you where it says number 1, I want everybody in this room, pick up your pencil. I want you to write down what you think this sign means for a driver. And then I walk around and make sure everybody's doing it. And at the end of the lesson, I take that piece of paper up perhaps as evidence of your engagement. That's a more specific, easy to see way of engaging. In our lesson, another engagement point will be that puzzle. We put everybody in small groups. They open up an envelope. It's got 10 signs in it and 10 scenarios, and they've got to match them up. I can see you doing it. That's a really great point of engagement. Even though you're working as a small group, everyone should be involved if I set it up well, and that engages you with the content. If I could take a picture of your small group working to put that puzzle together, and I could use that as evidence that I engaged all students with the content. Quick review, you represent, they express. How are they engaged? There could be overlap, but I'm going to encourage you not to put the same 2 things in this box that you put in this box. Look for your best engagement pieces go here, and then these are other ways that students are showing what they know about the content and expressing their understanding. And then in this PowerPoint, there are a couple of slides for you to review the ideas that I just discussed with you. And there's a website that tells you more about those boxes. Now we're ready to move on to page 2 of the lesson plan. And I'm going to jump back over here. So we've done all the boxes on 1, and now we're going to kick it into gear here, because this is really where you just show, hey, here's what we're doing in the order that we're doing it. A couple of things you should know. Remember, you're filling this form out because there's an assessor coming to watch you teach. You do not ever want to skip the pre-assessment or the post-assessment when you're being observed. Because on the reflection document, we haven't looked at this, but if you look at the reflection document and you read the questions, you can't answer these questions very well if you do not have data to support your ideas. One of the questions will ask you, well, what do you think the strengths of the lesson were based in evidence from the lesson? And how much have students have learned? How much did your students learn based in evidence? This is your evidence. You come in, I ask you to try this here to see how much you know. And at the end, I test you again to see how much you've learned. And these two assessments could be very, very similar. They don't have to be exactly the same, but they need to be testing your objectives. And notice that you'll describe the pre-assessment. Like students will come in and they will take a Google form assessment of the 10 road signs, identifying and explaining. This aligns with my objective because the lesson is about teaching students to identify and explain the 10 road signs, which sounds almost like I'm saying the same thing twice. And that's good because it really shows that my assessment is carefully aligned with my objective. At the end, same thing. Before students leave, they will take a second assessment. I might describe how it differs from the first if it differs at all, but that assessment should be assessing identification and explanation of those road signs because I do want things to be well aligned. Just like that graphic I showed you that had alignment at the top, here's the objective basically in assessment form. Here's the assessment at the end, and then this is the stuff that comes in the middle. This is what we're actually going to do. So I go through and I tell what I'm doing as my introduction. And my content exploration, that's basically the means of representation from the box before. What am I doing to represent the content? And I would do like numbers. The first thing I'm doing, second, third, fourth, fifth. Guided practice is where I've taught you some content and now I'm going to ask you to do something with it. Or we're going to do something together as a whole group or in small groups or individually. You're going to practice using that content in some way. Independent practice is where I have you work pretty much on your own. You don't have help from peers. You don't have a lot of help from me because at this point you ought to be ready to be able to do it on your own. Closure, bring it all together, maybe review everything, do our post-assessment. Extension is just a fancy word for homework. What am I asking you to do outside of the classroom? As far as our driver's ed lesson is concerned, our introduction is the small group activity where it's like an icebreaker. We play a game together that involves the road signs. Content exploration has two parts in our lesson. Part one is the presentation where we go through the first 5 and we ask questions. It's a very interactive lecture. Part 2 is a role play. Volunteer students will role play scenarios that have to do with the other 5 road signs. We'll probably show them on the screen too to keep them nice and visual. Guided practice is when we break you into small groups, you do the puzzle, and you try to line up the 10 road signs with the 10 explanations. The independent practice is where you as an individual are given a scenario, and you have to read the scenario and respond to the scenario based in 1, 2, maybe more of the road signs. Closure, so we review all the road signs, then we give the post-assessment before you walk out the door. Assessments, 2 types. Summative assessments, formative assessments. There are no summative assessments in my lesson. When you think of the word summative assessment, think of sum as in number. It has a number attached to it, like adding things up, a unit test, a chapter test, an exam. Like if I gave you guys an exam, 4 points over lesson planning, that would be a summative assessment of your understanding of lesson planning. It's at the end. Formative assessment is along the way, and formative assessments help me to form an understanding about what you're learning as we go, and for you to get an idea of what you know as we go. There are boxes here for every one of these sections, but you won't necessarily have something written in all these boxes. As far as what's the minimum, besides the pre and the post, which do not really count, don't put them over here because they've got their own boxes, 2 more. Look for 2 more ways that you'll be able to assess students' learning as you go. We have 2 planned in our driver's ed lesson. The first one is when after we teach the first 5 road signs, everyone's going to use their devices and they're going to take a pre-designed little assessment to see, do you know the first 5? So that's going to happen in this box. The second formative assessment is the guided practice where you work in small groups with the puzzle to line up the 10 road signs and the 10 explanations. So I would explain that here. Both of those will help me as the teacher and you as students to get a feel for how much you've learned so far. As the teacher, if we take that first assessment on the 5 and I'm looking at the results live and half the people have failed it, I better back up and I better teach the ones that people are not getting right again. Something did not work. If we do the small group assessment with the puzzle and there are 5 small groups working and every small group is able to line those up, maybe they've got 1 misplaced, then I should feel, gosh, everybody really got that. What we did together worked and you guys are ready for your assessment. But if half the groups have half the signs mismatched with their scenarios, something went wrong. I did not teach that very clearly, and we better back up before we try to move on to the assessment, because it's not going to be pretty if everybody only knows half of them. I won't have taught you as much as I thought that I taught you. And that's why you do the formative assessments, to help you get a feel for what people are understanding as you go. So we're done with the lesson plan, and I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint, and I've got some slides for you that talk about the pre-assessment and what that means. And then let's see, I've got some slides for you that have basically what do all those pieces mean of the assessment that we just talked about. Assessment, some tips about that, and we're ready to move on to the lesson analysis.